What is a resource pyramid, using coal as an example, and why does it not apply to oil and gas?
Many people also have the notion of the resource pyramid, like an iceberg, that so far we've just tapped the easy peak of this huge pyramid, and they say that, well, as costs rise or technology kicks in or whatever, we can gradually tap lower and lower levels of the pyramid. And this actually goes back to the experience of coal mining and mineral exploitation, which is very different from oil. You see, a coal deposit covers a wide area, and this is called a resource. The term resource is introduced for this huge deposit covering hundreds of square miles. But they go to the place where the seams are thickest and it's more economic, and also access has something to do with it. So in the case of coal, as prices rise or costs fall, then lower concentrations can be profitably developed. And so you have indeed, in the case of coal, you have a pyramid like this, so that it is an issue of concentration, and you can gradually tap lower and lower concentrations, and there's not what I would call a crisis. There's a gradual progression. Now, oil is different because it's a liquid and it's concentrated in nature in a few places, and the contact between the oil in the reservoir and the water that underlies it is just a matter of a few feet. There's a strange polarity about oil. It's either there in profitable abundance, or it isn't there at all. And this gives rise to a very different mindset. Many people in the resource domain have had their background in mineral exploration and think in terms of concentration. And they tend to fail to grasp this strange polarity about oil, not only in the individual fields, but where it is. I mean, only a simple glance at the oil map shows clusters of fields in some place that has got the right geology, separated by huge barren tracts, and not because people haven't looked there, it is because they just don't have the right geology. This affects also the way in which the stuff is produced, and this whole subject of peak and decline. There's a great polarity about oil, and even more so about gas in a sense.
Why don't we know more about the coming oil crisis?
Yes, well, why don't we know more about this whole issue? And the reasons basically are the extremely unreliable nature of public data in this. It goes back to the early days of producing oil in the onshore fields of the United States. And a strange feature of the United States is that there, and almost uniquely there, the mineral rights belong to the landowner. Elsewhere it usually belongs to the state. That means that the fields in the United States were highly fragmented, a huge number of different owners. And of course, in the early days, there was no shortage of promoters and speculators and various unscrupulous people who were promoting these various ventures and exaggerating the size of the reserves that they had. And so the Security and Exchange Commission moved long ago to try to control all of this, and it allowed these companies to report as so-called proved reserves. Proved reserves is the technical term for financial purposes, only such oil as is being drained by the current wells. Now this means that proved reserves, and these are reported for financial reasons, they do enter the public domain, and they naturally grow over time as people drill up their fields. And they don't really say anything much about the size of the field as a whole. And this was simply a pragmatic, sensible way in which reporting was controlled in the early days. Now, moving internationally and offshore, rather different conditions obtain, because here these fields are normally developed as a single field by a group of companies. One company is appointed the operator that does the work on behalf of a group of companies. And so offshore and internationally, they do indeed look at the full field size rather than just one little part of it. And certainly offshore, where they have to build a platform, they have to know more or less what the full field will deliver. But they still continue this old-fashioned reporting practices imposed, in fact, by the stock exchange rules that allows them only to report what is being currently drained, and says very little about the field as a whole. Of course, they found in practice, there's no conspiracy, this is just how it happened to unfold, they found this was a rather attractive way in which to work, because it meant that the companies had large amounts of discovered but unreported oil, which was a sort of inventory that they could draw down. I mean, it looks rather bad for an oil company to have a periodic discovery and then 10 lean years in between. This doesn't sit well with the investment community. And so they were able to smooth their assets by this reporting practices. And furthermore, it saved tax, because they had the lower the reserves, the higher the depletion allowance, and the higher write-off and so forth. And in foreign countries, it also had a certain political element. You know, you don't want to be seen to be too wealthy. So if you understate your assets, you are less a victim for expropriation. So for all of these many sound, sensible commercial and regulatory reasons, reserves have been underreported, and these underreported numbers have entered the public domain, and as a result they've grown. So if you simply plot national reserve numbers, as is in the public domain, you have a fairly straight upward line, and it makes eminent sense, as if that's all you had to work with, to project this ever upwards and say, well, there's just no problem, we're finding more and more oil. And the oil companies, of course, do and don't understand their own business. I mean, obviously there are people within it who do, but they also have their planners and economic people who think in that mindset. And so when they see this upward progression of reserves, they say, oh, well, we're doing better and better technology, we are getting more skillful. These are all desirable attributes to which medals are pinned on the chest. And so it's not very convenient for them to admit to when they actually found all of this oil. And it's very significant, I feel, extremely significant, that the chief executive of ExxonMobil, Mr. Harry Longwell, has indeed published the correct discovery trend, backdating all of these revisions to the dates on which they were found. And this gives an entirely different picture. This shows that discovery peaked around 1964, and it has been declining relentlessly ever since. Mr. Longwell himself, and this is no mean authority, this is the chief of the world's largest oil company, he says, looking ahead to meeting demand out to 2010, he says less than half of it can come from existing fields, and it would cost more than $1 trillion to deliver. He speaks of the challenge of doing so, but this is an oblique way of saying it can't be done. So here we have a confession, really, from one of the world's largest oil companies that this just isn't going to happen. And now, this reserve growth applies to the large old fields where they had the luxury of underreporting what they found. Now, the more recent fields, the deep water fields, the more difficult offshore fields, the smaller ones, have a short production life, and very likely they have to be pretty optimistic in planning the project to get it to go at all. And so we find, and Norwegian experience confirms this, we find that many of these smaller fields, in fact, disappoint. Far from having reserve growth, you have negative growth. And so the great mistake that some analysts, including particularly the US Geological Survey, is to extrapolate the growth of these big old fields into the future, which is just a non sequitur. The new fields that are being found are not going to grow in the same way as some of the old ones did. And when I say grow, nothing actually grew. It was simply in the reporting practices. And in order to backdate the revisions to the discovery of the fields that they came from, means that you have to have access to the details of every field when it was found on a field-by-field basis, and you simply flat can't do it on national statistics which don't attribute it to individual fields. So the reason, even if people understood this particular strange phenomenon that's distorted the picture, they'd be very hard-pressed to actually make the corrections unless they had access to what we can call the industry's database. And the industry's database is a commercial database that has been built up with the cooperation of the companies, which does indeed cover the full spectrum of what is known about every single field. It covers some 20,000 fields throughout the world, has